Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. I often find myself in the grocery store reading these labels, but wondering what the heck half of them even mean. I know extra virgin olive oil is the one that you want to drizzle on your food because it imparts more of a flavor. And I have a favorite one from Trader Joe's, the Spanish olive oil, for my salads and such. But really, what do most of those labels like unrefined or on eggs, pasture-raised versus cage-free versus range-free really mean? So today, we're going to talk a little bit about these different food labels and how you can understand them better to pick out the best food for you. We're going to start with oils, and then we're going to talk about eggs, some meats, and go from there. All right. So when you're trying to pick an olive oil or any kind of cooking oil, it's really going to depend on what you're planning to do with it. I'm sure you've heard of an oil smoke point. So that's just the point when your oil is going to start smoking and burning, and it will affect its flavor quite a bit. Now, in addition to it hurting how flavorful it's supposed to be, it can also degrade some of the nutrients in there and start releasing those free radicals we talked about a few episodes back. So we don't want those free radicals because remember they cause you lots of oxidative stress, and we want to move away from those. So since our cells produce those on their own, we want to make sure we are not adding anything else into our bodies that is also causing that. So to determine which ones you want, there are a few disagreements as to what's healthiest, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. So olive oil is one of the most popular because it's super versatile. You can do just about anything with olive oil. Now, with extra virgin olive oil, you want one that's not overly processed, so not super refined. Extra virgin means exactly that. It's higher quality, it's not mega refined. So you also like olive oil because that's extra virgin, because it's largely monounsaturated fats and some polyunsaturated fatty acids. Many studies have linked that to better heart health, and their relatively lower smoke point compared to lower oils means that it's really good for low to medium heat cooking, and it's really healthy when baking. So I like to put it on my salads. I like to put it in my pastas and such after I finish cooking them. Now, sometimes in the United States, extra virgin isn't what it claims to be. In 2015, a group named the National Consumers League tested several different olive oils, 10 or so, and found that 6 out of those failed to meet the standards to classify as actually being extra virgin. So that is a problem. We want to make sure that the brands we're choosing are actually meeting those standards of what they say they are. So some of those brands include California Olive Ranch and Cola Vita. So those are 2 that are generally widely available and tend to be really high quality. One of my personal favorites is coconut oil. So coconut oil, you don't want to use it too often because it has high saturated fat content really, but it has some really good elements in that saturated fat, like the lauric acid. So it's not all bad, even though it is largely saturated fat. But, not everyone really agrees that having a high concentrated source of saturated fat is necessarily a no-go. The American Heart Association believes that replacing foods that are high in saturated fat with healthier options can lower your blood cholesterol levels, those LDLs, those bad ones, and improve your overall fat profiles. But, science is kind of starting to suggest that not all saturated fats are bad for you, like I mentioned with that lauric acid in there. So what I like to do with olive oil is I'll use it generally as a butter replacement. You can use it as a 1-to-1 butter replacement. So if I'm going to make yuca, I will, parboil it, and then I'm going to, put a little bit of coconut oil in that pan and cook it the rest of the way. And it's really delicious when you do it that way, but sprinkle a little bit of salt on top of it, and that's all you need for that side dish, really. But I don't like to put a lot of oils into my baking. So although it says you can use coconut oil in your baking, instead of oils, I tend to substitute unsweetened applesauce. So I buy the little cups of it sometimes because those are about exactly how much you need to put in there. I think they're about half a cup or so. And it's really easy to substitute that in there. It's unsweetened, so they haven't put a whole bunch of junk in it. And it just makes the cake so moist. The next time you make cupcakes, you should really try it. My sister Mimi is who taught me that trick, and it is amazing. Go for it. So sometimes we are going to pick a different type of oil, and sometimes we can substitute something wholly different from oil, period. So that also means you don't have to ban oil from your pantry all the time. If we substitute other things in that are healthier on other occasions, then we can really still enjoy those oils in moderation in other places where they lend it more flavor. I don't feel like they lend a lot of flavor in my baking, so that's why I use that applesauce instead. So I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything either. Saturated fats can be a healthier oil to cook with when you're using a very high temperature though, like when you're frying food. So we don't want to fry a ton of foods, but every now and then we can have some fried food as a treat. And that's because they're more stable at a high heat than other types of fats. So they're less likely to break down and smoke and release all of those free radicals that wreak havoc on our cells. Vegetable oil. So you guys, vegetable oil actually just refers to any oil that comes from a plant. And the healthfulness of it is going to really depend on which plant it's derived from and how you're using it. A lot of those on the market are a blend of canola, soybean, safflower, palm, corn, sunflower oils. It's a lot of different things. And generally, I would recommend that you should use olive oil whenever you can instead of using one of those canola oils. It's not because canola oil is necessarily always terrible for you, but rather because you're going to get more health benefits from having olive oils. Now that said, they can be kind of unhealthful because they are very refined now and very processed. So not only are they lacking a lot of flavor, they just kind of taste like oil, but they also lack a lot of nutrients. They're super processed, and they just call it vegetable oil so that the people who make it can put in whatever they want without having to print a new label, which I think is kind of gross and terrifying. But, it is what it is. We just have to recognize it for what it is, just like we're processing mindfulness, and make our decision and go from there. So those processed oils really have been broken down, a lot of them with hexane, and So they're chemically processed as well as mechanically processed. And it's pushed them past their heat tolerance, and they've really messed up the flavor profile of it and just the chemical composition. And so a lot of these oils, especially palm oil, are more likely to degrade for production. It's not great. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue talking about some different types of oils.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Talking about the difference between vegetable oil, coconut oil, and olive oil, and how to really read those labels to understand which one of these is the best for you. We're wanting to make sure that we're looking for things that aren't very refined. The word virgin or extra virgin can also indicate to us that it's not highly processed, although not all things that are labeled as extra virgin are necessarily meeting the bar for that when they are tested by people who are outside of that industry. So next up, we're going to talk about canola oil. Canola oil comes from the rapeseed plant, so it has flowers, it's kind of pretty, and it contains a lot of monounsaturated fats, and a good amount of polyunsaturated fats as well. Canola tends to have the least amount of saturated fats out of all of the vegetable oils, and it has a really high smoke point. So you can use it for high heat cooking, like when you're frying food. But in the US, it also tends to be highly processed, just like those other types of vegetable oil. So it means that there's not really a lot of nutrients overall. You want to look for cold pressed or unprocessed canola oil, but that can be really difficult to find. So check those labels. If it says cold pressed or unprocessed, go for it. If you don't see it on there, you might want to try for a different type of oil, like a mixed oil. So they have some that are, part canola oil, part regular olive oil, so the kind that's not extra virgin, and that's good for higher temperatures. If you get a good mix of that, at least you're getting some nutrients in there instead of just getting all of that canola oil or those other types of vegetable oils down. So try for a mix of them if you're going to be using it for high heat cooking. One of my personal favorites that I use a ton in the kitchen is avocado oil. Just like extra virgin olive oil, it is unrefined, but it also has a higher smoking point than extra virgin olive oil. So I use that for cooking at higher heats than extra virgin olive oil, because remember, that's good for like low to medium high. And it's really great for a lot of stir fries and stuff because it doesn't impart a lot of flavor into your food. It's really delicious. It's a little bit creamy, just like avocados are. And it also contains both monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So it has one of the highest monounsaturated fat contents among cooking oils, as well as vitamin E. So it has a ton of vitamin E in it and is really good for you overall. The downside of it is that it tends to be more expensive, but I like to go to stores like Marshall's to buy a lot of my cooking oils. They are definitely still in date. There's nothing wrong with them. Generally, they might be short-coated, which means that they are going to go bad in the next few months, or their expiration date is the next few months, but really that's a best buy date for the most part. And that just means, hey, I need to cook a lot, and I need to cook more at home rather than eating out anyway. So just keep an eye on those dates, but also go out to these different stores and get these cheaper oils. They're really good, and it kind of helps negate how expensive the avocado oils and other types tend to be, especially if you cook frequently like I do. Another oil that is really high in vitamin E is sunflower oil. It's also just a really pretty oil, in my opinion. 1 tablespoon of it contains 28% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin E. That is a lot of vitamin E. It's way better, as we've discussed before, to get your vitamins from your food rather than taking supplements, and sunflower oil is an excellent way to get your vitamin E. It has a high smoke point, and just like avocado oil, does not have a super strong flavor, so it's not going to overwhelm your dish in different flavors like extra virgin olive oil tends to do. Sunflower oil does contain a lot of omega-6 fatty acids, and they have been thought to be inflammatory. So they can cause some inflammation in your body according to some research. Your body needs them, but having a bunch of them can be problematic, especially if you are prone to inflammation or if you have, autoimmune issues where inflammation is already a problem for your body. Omega-3s, on the other hand, are anti-inflammatory. So you want to try to balance out your omega-3s with your omega-6s. If you have too many, then you can get excess inflammation in the body. Too many omega-6s without getting enough omega-3s, that is. So moderation with those omega-6s is key. You might want to use more avocado oil, but having a little bit of sunflower oil on your different types of food that you're cooking with can be really good. Peanut oil is my absolute favorite for the holidays. I love a turkey cooked in peanut oil. So, it's Thanksgiving. You only have this once a year. It's okay to have it as your treat. And nut oils, especially peanut oil, can be really fun to use in the kitchen because there are so many different types and they have such a great flavor and a nice nutty smell, and they cook really well at high heat. They also have one of the highest monounsaturated fat contents among all cooking oils, so they are a fantastic choice. One that we probably don't think of much, though, is walnut oil. It has a low smoke point, so it's not great for cooking, but you can use it in all kinds of other ways, like putting it over fresh fruit or pancakes. If you like walnut syrup with your pancakes, instead of walnut syrup, you can try this walnut oil. It's a really good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, so it's a little bit better than some of the other oils we talked about, like sunflower oil in that regard. So that's going to help you keep your inflammation in check by balancing the proportion of the omega-6s and the omega-3s that you're consuming. So this way, you still get the omega-6s that your body needs without causing those inflammation issues. Flaxseed oil, you may have seen this mentioned before, but it's not really discussed a lot. It's also very high in omega-3s, so the good omegas, and it has a very low smoke point. So we don't want to cook with it a lot. You really shouldn't cook with it at all, in my opinion. Use it for making your own dressings. You do have to store it at a low temperature location though, so keep this one probably in your refrigerator. Okay, my last one is sesame oil. So I love sesame oil. It is so flavorful. I use it a lot when I'm cooking stir fries and stuff, of course, because it's going to give you a very strong flavor with just a little bit of oil. Use like a dime to a nickel size amount really for a lot of stir fries. A little bit is going to go a long way with this one because it is so flavorful. It also contains a lot of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, but it's not especially high in other nutrients beyond that. It does have a higher smoke point, so you can use it for high heat recipes. That is going to be one of my go-tos when I am cooking specific types of food. I use it a lot when I am cooking Chinese food recipes, and it is absolutely delicious. Now, that is about all I have for you guys right now for oils. When we come back, we're going to talk about the difference between these monounsaturated, unsaturated, polyunsaturated fats, all that jazz, and discuss why each of those is good or bad for you.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Different types of oils like avocado oil, sunflower oil, walnut oil, and the different types of cooking that you can use these for based on their smoke point. And in addition to cooking, which ones are better for like putting in your salad dressing. Now we're going to talk about what some of those terms I was throwing around really mean. Polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, all that jazz, and which ones are good and bad for you. For a long time, fat was just really disregarded as having any health benefits in the general vernacular, but it is actually really good for us depending on the type of fat that you get. And fat is necessary for your body, for giving it a source of energy, for absorbing vitamins and minerals. Remember, we talked about how some vitamins and minerals are water soluble in a previous episode, and others are fat soluble. So you need that in there to process some of these vitamins and minerals. Fat also helps you build cell membranes. So that's the outside of the cells, and it also surrounds nerves. So like your myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths are like these little sleeves that cover your neurons, and they're made up of cells that contain fat to insulate your neurons from electrical activity. That helps to increase how quickly it can transmit signals in your brain as well. So we want to make sure that we are taking good care of all of our cells. And in order to do that, we need fat. You also need it for blood clotting, for moving your muscles, and for preventing inflammation, like we talked about in the last segment with those omega-3 fatty acids. So they are called fatty acids for a reason, and we're going to get them from fats. For your long-term health, though, some fats are definitely better than others. We talked about which types of oils to use for that, for your ingesting in general, in the last segment. And really the good ones that we talked about a lot that were in olive oil and such were those monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. And the bad ones are generally going to be trans fats. Those are your hyper-processed ones that they tend to be industrial made. And your body gets really confused because it's like, what is this processed garbage that I'm putting into my body? What are you doing to me? So saturated fats, on the other hand, fall somewhere in the middle. All fats are made of a similar chemical structure, which is carbon atoms bonded to hydrogen atoms. And the thing that differentiates one fat from the other is the length and shape of that chain of carbon atoms and the number of hydrogen atoms that are connected to the carbon atoms. So at the chemical level, it might seem to be tiny, slight differences in its structure, but that can really mean very important differences in its form and its function. So essentially the anatomy and the physiology of these fats that we're consuming. Let's start with the bad news. I always like to start bad news first. So we're going to start with the trans fats. It is the worst type of dietary fat, and it's a byproduct of the process called hydrogenation. So you've heard of hydrogenated oils, and it's used to turn healthy oils into solids to keep them from turning rancid. So think, the solid oils that we sometimes cook with. I have used them before for cooking fried chicken because they are delicious, but I tend to stay away from them now. They don't really have any health benefits. If you've ever eaten a spoonful of Crisco, I did it. I just want to know what it tasted like. I want to know what flavor it was imparting into my food. But it doesn't really have much flavor. Sometimes they can taste almost like plastic or it just tastes like oil in a way without any of the nuttiness of, walnut oil or peanut oil, or without the creamy flavor of avocado oil or that richness of extra virgin olive oil, like that Spanish olive oil from Trader Joe's. Trans fats have no health benefits in them, none that are known to us anyway. And by us, I mean the health population in general, people who study it and look into it. And there is not really a safe level of consumption. So they've been officially banned in the United States at this point. The FDA decided in 2015 that artificial trans fats are not safe to eat, and they gave food producers 3 years to completely cut them out from our food supply. So that deadline was June 18th, 2018, and they recently gave them a 1-year extension to use them in limited circumstances, such as for grease for industrial baking pans. And that means they were not really cut all the way out until about halfway through 2019 last year. We didn't really need to give that extension, in my opinion, but that's neither here nor there. My opinion does not matter to the FDA. But for the most part, they are largely out of our food supply. Crisco, as I mentioned earlier, has significantly reduced how much trans fat they have in their shortening, but that's just enough to allow them to legally claim 0 grams of trans fat per serving on the label. But if you look at their ingredient list, it still tends to contain partially hydrogenated soybean oil. And as we just mentioned, those hydrogenation processes are what turns those healthy oils into solids. So we don't really want that because trans fats are a byproduct of that process. Now, as food makers have learned some new ways to use partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, they put them in everything from cookies and pastries to fast food. So French fries were cooked in them for a long time too. Malcolm Gladwell has a really good podcast on revisionist history, and one of my favorite episodes, he gets very passionate about how McDonald's changed their recipe from using beef tallow to cook their fries to using vegetable oil, because we went through that craze, as I mentioned before, in the 80s and 90s, I believe, where we were like, oh no, fats are bad, let's not eat any more animal fat. And so they started cooking it in vegetable oil. And that's why French fries today from McDonald's don't tend to taste as good, in my opinion, and in Malcolm Gladwell's opinion, as they did when we were younger. It's not just in your head, they change the recipe by changing what they're cooking them in. Eating lots of trans fats is going to increase the amount of the bad cholesterol, LDL, in your bloodstream, and it's also going to reduce the amount of beneficial cholesterols, your HDLs. So those trans fats create inflammation, just like those omega-6s can also contribute to that. But since there's no nutritional value in here, there's no omega-3s to balance out the inflammation that's being caused. And this has been linked to heart disease, diabetes, strokes, and a bunch of other chronic conditions. We talked about diabetes and sugar in a recent episode and how insulin resistance is related to type 2 diabetes. And these trans fats also contribute to insulin resistance. So we want to give our bodies the best chance that they have to do what they're supposed to do. And in order to do that, we should really be avoiding trans fats because even small amounts of it can be really detrimental to your health. For every 2% of calories from trans fats consumed each day, your risk of heart disease rises by 23%, according to Harvard Health. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the good news, saturated fats that are kind of in between, and our monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were breaking down trans fats and how those can be really bad for you because they have no nutrients. They're artificially derived through the process of hydrogenation and are really just all around super unhealthy for you and can lead to heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. Up next, though, we're going to talk about the good fats. So saturated fats aren't the best, but they are somewhere in between in health levels of the trans fats and the unsaturated fats. So saturated fats are pretty common in the American diet, at least. Think bacon grease when it's cold. I also really love Italian sausage, specifically spicy Italian sausage. And it's weirdly one of the few things that my cat will also try to eat when I eat it. She likes spicy foods. It's very strange. And Chinese sausage. That's another one of my favorites. Chinese sausage is delicious. It's very high in fat, but it makes my brain feel really nice. And it has a lot of saturated fat in it. So when I cook, if it sits and cools in the pan, then it's going to turn more solid. But what really is saturated fat? Some common sources of that include red meat, some whole milk, and other whole milk dairy foods like cheese, which is bae. To be honest, in my life, I love cheese. Cheese before everything. Cheese over everything. And I put a lot of cheese in my food. So when I eat spaghetti, I don't even just put not mozzarella. I don't even just put Parmesan in it. I like to put mozzarella in my spaghetti. I like it to be nice and cheesy and goopy. Forget just using cheesy bread. I just put the cheese directly into the pasta bowl, and that way I'm not eating the carbs from the bread too. Put cheese on everything. But, I guess as a treat, be careful about the types of cheese that you're eating as well because, they are full of saturated fats, even if they are delicious. So you can eat it every day, but we have to be careful about that, about how much we're eating each day. Coconut oil also has a lot of saturated fat in it, and so do a lot of commercially cooked baked goods and other foods. So things that are prepackaged already. The word saturated really is referring to the number of hydrogen atoms that surround each carbon atom in those carbon chains that we talked about in our last segment. In the case of saturated fats, that carbon chain holds as many hydrogen atoms as possible. It means, clearly, it just is saturated with hydrogens. So is it really bad for you per se? Well, a diet that is saturated in saturated fats can drive up your total cholesterol and make it tend to be more of that harmful LDL cholesterol that, kind of tells your body to make blockages in your arteries in your heart and other places in your body. So that's not great. And most health nutrition experts recommend limiting it to under 10% of your calories per day. So saturated fats in general. So remember, think cheese, whole milk, red meat, coconut oil, all that good stuff that's very tasty. A handful of recent reports, according to Harvard Health, have muddied the link between saturated fat and heart disease. A meta-analysis of 21 studies, so it's a study of other studies, said there was not enough evidence to conclude that saturated fat increases the risk of heart disease, but that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat might reduce the risk of heart disease. So it may not be, according to these studies, that replacing the saturated fat is really necessary. It's not that the saturated fat is necessarily causing the problem itself, but rather that polyunsaturated fat is better for you because it has nutrients in it, has a lot more nutrients in it, and it can help reduce your risk of heart disease. So saturated fat might be just null at that point, but polyunsaturated fat is helpful. There were 2 other major studies that went further into that, and they found that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats like vegetable oils or high fiber carbs was way better for you in the long term for reducing your risk of heart disease. But if you replace saturated fat with highly processed carbs, that could in fact do the opposite. So we want to make sure that we are trying to avoid processed foods whenever we can. That's where meal prepping can really be our best friend. So remember in our previous episode, we discussed, an hour and a half of meal prep time once a week can really make a big difference for you in the long run. Because what we're looking for is pre-prepared foods. And if we make that for ourselves, then we don't have to be getting them from, the frozen food section where they're not going to be as healthy. Now the good part are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. So these good fats are going to come mainly from vegetables, nuts, fish, seeds. They are going to be different from saturated fats because they have fewer hydrogen atoms bonded to the carbon atoms. So remember in that carbon chain, when it's saturated, it just means the hydrogen atoms saturate the carbon ones. They are as many of those crammed on there as there can possibly be. So it's just changing that form and function of the fat in that carbon chain. Healthy fats tend to be liquid at room temperature, not solid. So think about olive oil, avocado oils, how those are always liquid. They're never at any point turning into a solid, even when they're just sitting out on your counter. There are 2 main categories of beneficial fats, and they're super broad: monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. For monounsaturated fats, think about dipping your bread in olive oil at an Italian restaurant, or if you're me, at the house with that Spanish olive oil. So good. A little bit of Parmesan. It's delicious. Then in that case, you're getting mostly monounsaturated fat. They have a single carbon-to-carbon double bond, and that means that it has 2 fewer hydrogen atoms than a saturated fat, and they bend at that double bond. So when we say that it changes the structure and the function, that is what we mean. So when it changes how the carbon atoms and the hydrogen atoms relate to each other in number and in arrangement, it can bend those at the double bond. And that is going to keep monounsaturated fats liquid at room temperature. It's their structure, their chemical makeup that keeps them liquid there. I thought that was pretty fascinating. The good sources of monounsaturated fats are the ones we talked about more in our first segment. So that peanut oil, olive oil, avocados, a lot of nut oils like your walnut oils, and high oleic safflower and sunflower oils. It's important that they do have those nutrients in them. Now, we found that monounsaturated fats could be healthful when the 7-country study was conducted in the 1960s, and that's really where a lot of the Mediterranean diet studies came from. That showed us that people in Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean really enjoyed a low rate of heart disease despite a high-fat diet. So the main fat in their diet was not from animal fat, like is common in most countries that have high rates of heart disease. Because remember, animal fat is saturated fat. It's solid at room temperature. But olive oil is mainly what they're eating in the Mediterranean diet, and that contains mostly monounsaturated fat. So when you eat the Mediterranean diet, the olive oil is going to be a large component of that. Also, nut and seed oils. And nut and seed oils have been found to be really helpful in reducing risks of diabetes as well. There's not really a recommended daily amount of monounsaturated fats that you should consume, but the Institute of Medicine recommends using them as much as possible along with polyunsaturated fats just to replace your saturated and trans fats. So like we discussed earlier, instead of cooking with that beef tallow like McDonald's used to, they use vegetable oil and stuff now, and it might not be as flavorful as, say, duck fat fries. Those are delicious, but it is going to be better for you in the long run to use more of an oil mix like that olive oil, canola oil blend I mentioned earlier, or peanut oil if you're not allergic to peanuts. I know that nut allergies can be a big problem for a lot of people. But other than that, you do have a lot of options for what you can use instead. Polyunsaturated fats are also largely associated with liquid cooking oils. So in our first segment, we talked a lot about the different types of oils, and I said polyunsaturated and monounsaturated a lot. That's why. So sunflower oil, safflower oil, corn oil, those are all examples of those cooking oils that are liquid at room temperature. And they are essential fats. That means you need them in your body for regular body functioning, and your body cannot make these on their own. So you have to get them from your food. So you do need some fats. So when you make that salad, go ahead and drizzle a little bit of olive oil or avocado oil over the top of it so that you can be getting these healthy fats. They, as we said before, are used to build cell membranes and cover those nerves and those neurons with those myelin sheaths. And they're needed for blood clotting and muscle movement and to prevent inflammation because they have omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. Indeed, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are the two main types of polyunsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats are different from monounsaturated fats because they have two or more of those double bonds in that carbon chain. So they are also bent at the double bonds, and they have a different structure that way that makes them liquid at room temperature, very similar to the monounsaturated fats. They just have multiple bends because of the double bonds. Now, the number in omega-3 and omega-6 really refers to how far it is between the beginning of the carbon chain and the first double bond. That's it. Both of them are healthy in different ways, but omega-3s prevent inflammation or fight inflammation, and omega-6s can contribute to it. So eating these polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated fats or super refined and processed carbs can really help reduce your LDL cholesterol. And that is something that if you eat a lot of cheese and stuff like I do, you really need. You need to have some more polyunsaturated fat in your life. It improves your overall cholesterol profile and lowers your triglycerides. So it helps get rid of all those bad things associated with fats and cholesterol in your body. One really great source of omega-3 fatty acid is fatty fish. So my personal favorite there is going to be salmon. I absolutely love salmon. There are so many good ways that you can bake it to be really healthy and just overall delicious. Put some lemon on it. You don't even need to do anything unhealthy to salmon to make it delicious. My ex really loves mackerel. He'll get that if we go out to get sushi and stuff. I'm not a big mackerel fan. It's a little too fishy for me, but salmon is my go-to. He also likes sardines, which I am not into, but they're really good for you if you like fishier fish. They have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, and so do flaxseed and unhydrogenated soybean oil. So just because it says it's soybean oil doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for you. We just want to make sure that it's not going through that hydrogenation process. Walnuts also are a great source of omega-3s. So these omega-3s are important because they can help prevent and even treat heart disease and stroke. So they not only reduce your blood pressure and raise your good cholesterol, your HDLs, and lower those triglycerides, but they can help you prevent lethal heart rhythms. So you can have really bad heart rhythms. Just the way that your heart beats can cause a lot of problems, and that can be caused by the fats and stuff that are in your body. Evidence also suggests that they could probably reduce the need for corticosteroid medications in people who have rheumatoid arthritis. So those autoimmune disorders I mentioned earlier, rheumatoid arthritis is one of them. And the corticosteroids are there to help prevent inflammation or to lower the inflammation that's there. And these omega-3s, since they also help with lowering inflammation, have a really strong impact on your health. Now, that's not saying that you could fix it all with diet. I am not at all saying that. That would be condescending and rude of me. Rheumatoid arthritis is very much, an autoimmune disorder, and definitely do what your doctor is recommending. Take the medications as prescribed. But if we're also trying to set our bodies up for success, I recommend additionally using some dietary changes like omega-3 fatty acids in fish. Just eat more salmon. It's delicious. I don't really need a reason beyond it being delicious to eat more of it. One of my favorite foods. There have been other studies linking omega-3s to a whole host of health improvements, like the risk of dementia. So they thought that it reduces your risk, but a lot of those studies are inconclusive, and several of them have major flaws, according to a study by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. So take those with a grain of salt. I feel like a lot of fats are a little bit tastier with a little bit of salt anyway. Omega-6 fatty acids, on the other hand, have also been linked to the protection against heart disease. So they might also cause some inflammation, but they can be good for your heart. Foods rich in linoleic acid and other omega-6s are vegetable oils like safflower, sunflower, walnut oil, and corn oils and soybean oils. So those can be very beneficial to you as well. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how to read those egg packages to pick out the eggs that are best for you.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Segment, we were talking about the differences between good fats and in-between fats. Now we're going to talk a little bit about eggs. So we see a lot of labels on eggs that say things like cage-free, free-range, pasture-raised, and they're supposed to really indicate to us that the animals are treated humanely and that they get some space, but the labels really sound good, but what do they actually mean? Pasture-raised is not regulated by the USDA at all, and the regulations for the ones that are regulated by them tend to not be very specific. There's a group called the Humane Farm Animal Care, and they're a nonprofit dedicated to improving the lives of farm animals. They've made a more detailed guideline for it, and you might see that on a label as being the HFAC certified humane. So here's what these things mean. Cage-free is regulated by the USDA. That just means they don't live in cages. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have a lot of space or that they're able to go outdoors. Generally, they live in a barn or a similar structure, and their living conditions can be really cramped. That's not necessarily always the case. If they come with the certified humane status from HVAC, that means they had at least 1.5 square foot of space each. I don't know about you. That doesn't feel like a lot of personal space to me. Free range is another term that is regulated by the USDA, and that really just tells us that these animals had continuous outdoor access during their production cycle. That doesn't mean that they actually went outside, though. That just means that there is a way for them to go outside. So it's kind of tricky that it's phrased that way. Now, that is a step towards a more humane way of treating the animals than just cage-free in philosophy, but according to an NPR study, it really might just mean that they had a few small doors that led to a screened-in porch that had cement, dirt, or a modicum of grass, unquote. So to be free-range and certified humane, there must be a minimum of 2 square feet of outdoor space per bird. So if you see that HVAC symbol on it, that's what that means. For pasture-raised eggs, that's not regulated by the USDA. But in order for it to be labeled as certified humane, it means that the hens were given a lot of space to roam outdoors. That's 108 square feet. But they also have access to a barn for shelter should they elect to use it. That mandated space means they have a lot of room to allow for rotating the hens and making sure that they have fresh food to pick at. So the fresh food is, they can go out there and get bugs and all kinds of stuff off the ground, but they tend to supplement their feed as well. So the supplemented feed just tends to be like, corn feed and such. There is a really great company that I really enjoy getting eggs from. They're named Vital Farms, and they actually give you a visual for what the different terms look like because they really care about these animals and they treat them really well. I recommend Vital Farms. If you could get your eggs from a farmer's market or something, that would likely be better. But Vital Farms in general, I think is a pretty good company. And, they do care about having ethically produced food. So it's not just about treating your food ethically by human standards, but also treating the animals ethically, and I really enjoy them. They also sell butter and ghee, so I haven't found the butter or ghee in my grocery stores yet, but those eggs are the ones that we tend to pick up for the house. They're delicious. They have a better shell in general than a lot of other eggs I've found. You want your shells to be a little firm. That means that they're healthy. I grew up on a farm, and eggs can look very different and have a very different texture depending on what the animals are really eating, how much calcium and stuff that they're getting in their shells, in their bodies to produce these shells. And I've seen them come out as like a little gelatinous blob before. And it's like, okay, this one hen is not getting enough of a certain nutrient that she needs to form a hard shell. Let's see what's going on with her, because the others are having these nice firm shells for us. So there's a lot that you can tell from an eggshell, actually. So we want the ones that are going to have a little, they're a little firm. We don't want the ones that have give to them as much. Those are not typically as great. Also, when you crack your eggs open, you want more of that orangey color. That's good. We don't want that light yellowish color. That's not so great. The thicker the shells and the harder the shells and the darker the yolk, the better those eggs tend to be for you. So if you want to know just by looking at the eggs in your kitchen right now, if they are good or not, go ahead, crack one open, and see how it looks. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about meat labels. See you in just a second.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about eggs, what the difference is between cage-free, free-range, all that jazz means for eggs. Now we're going to talk a little bit about meat. So grass-fed, free-range, organic, what does that mean in terms of meat? Because that's going to be different from what is meant by it when it is referred to with eggs. And specifically, I am talking about chicken eggs. I kind of take that for granted a lot of times, but there are all kinds of different eggs that people consume. So the best way to find meat raised with specific standards is to find a farm or like a butcher shop or just a meat producer in general that follows practices that are important to you and how you want to get your meat sourced. We like to go to a butcher shop nearby, actually, and it's really great meat. They don't put any filler or anything in the chicken. None of that saline to plump it up and cost you more money. No extra preservatives or anything. So that does mean that we have to eat the chicken or freeze it within 2 days of purchase. But, it's neither here nor there. That doesn't really bother me. We go ahead and cook it or we freeze it. It's that simple. It's not that the meat is any worse than any other type of meat. It's just that it's more natural, and when things are dead, they decompose. That's life. So, we are going to discuss a little bit about free range first. So, there are standards for free range, and also called free roaming for chickens, but that is not the case for other meat. The chickens that are free range, like we discussed earlier, must have access to the outdoors, but that's not necessarily going to be a pasture. It could be a concrete slab, and they are not even guaranteed to have gone outside. They might just have a door there and not necessarily enough space for all of them to be outside. When you are applying the label of free range to eggs or to meat that is other than chickens, then that label doesn't mean anything. It's just fluff that is meant to make you feel good on the outside of it. It's branding and marketing, and it's not quite puffery. Puffery is like when a company says that they have the world's best pizza. It's like a grand, puffed out chest kind of claim, and it's not quite that, but it is a similar type of marketing meant to make you feel better about purchasing it and to manipulate you into thinking that you've made a better purchase that is more ethical than it really is. In most cases, it means the animal has access to the outdoors, though. That's generally what it means, even if they don't actually go outside. For grass-fed, that means that the animals mostly eat grass. USDA grass-fed beef has only had a grass diet and it has access to a pasture year-round. By it, I mean the cows. Now, if you just leave cows alone, they will just eat grass their entire lives. Again, I grew up on a farm. That is just what they do, but a lot of them are supplemented in their feed from these certain types of grains and such. But grass-fed means that if it says 100% grass-fed or grass-finished, and it's verified by a third party like the American Grass-Fed Association, similar to how HFAC will verify stuff, then that guarantees that those cows have been fed only grass and hay. However, this program is voluntary through the USDA and does not have its own third-party verification. So look for that AGA certification on it if you really care about it being grass-fed. If it says natural on the product, natural is super misleading, and it's alarming that they put it on meat in a way. And I say that being very pro lab-grown meat. I'm pro, Impossible Burger and all that. I'm not a vegetarian by any means, but I do believe in trying to ethically and sustainably source my food the best that I can. So with the USDA, when they say natural or all natural, that means just that your food has been minimally processed and doesn't have any preservatives or other types of artificial ingredients. That is true of all fresh meat in the U.S. So that label doesn't really mean anything. It's just misleading. So if it says natural, it's, again, just blowing smoke at you, and it's meant to make you feel good without carrying any real meaning. Marketing ploy, manipulative, ignore it. Naturally raised, those standards are being developed by the FDA, and they are presumably supposed to prohibit the use of hormones, antibiotics, or feeding them animal byproducts. So right now, or including animal byproducts in your food. That label doesn't really have any legal meaning or verifiable standards as such, but it's in development, so maybe naturally raised will get to a point where it has some meaning. If it says no antibiotics, then the people who produce that meat have to submit documentation that those cows were not given any antibiotics in order to label their beef raised without antibiotics. But again, there is not a third-party verification or testing for this. That's true for pork, chicken, and cattle. So if you're eating beef, pork, chicken, it isn't really verified by anyone. So they can kind of say that. They have to submit their documentation, but documentation can also be forged. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, just making everyone aware. Now, if it says no hormones administered, then according to the person who produced it, they have not been given growth hormones. They also have to submit paperwork for that, and it's also not third-party verified, just like the no antibiotics label. You should be suspicious of labels that say hormone-free or no hormones, since all meat that we are eating in the U.S., it naturally contains hormones. You have hormones. Animals have hormones. That's part of how they live and function. You want to see it say no hormones administered. So no hormones added. That is the important component. Hormone-free and no hormones, that doesn't really mean anything. All living creatures that have blood and stuff essentially have hormones. Organic, make sure it says USDA certification for organic, USDA certified. That forbids the use of growth hormones, antibiotics, GMO feed, genetically modified feed, or animal byproducts in raising the livestock. Beyond that, it does not address how they're treated or how they live, how much space they have, if they have access to a pasture, etc. So if you care about how they're treated, then you're going to want them pasture raised. But if you care more about what's going into your food, organic is the label that you are looking for. It doesn't mean that it's ethical. It just means that it has not had any growth hormones or antibiotics administered. That's pretty much it. For pastured, there's no legal standard for that. They usually just use it to emphasize the animal has been primarily raised in the pasture where chickens can, hunt for their food, pigs can root around in the dirt, and cows can just browse around for, grass to graze on. But it doesn't really mean anything legally. So really, organic has a meaning. No hormones administered has a meaning. But a lot of these things are not actually regulated by the USDA. And even if they are not verified by a third party. They just send in paperwork. So that is how we read the labels for meat. I hope that this has been super informative for you guys in learning about the different types of oils, eggs, and meat, and how to read those labels in the grocery store to really get the products that you want that are both good for you and that have the ethical issues that you care about. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, really appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.